On October the 7th, ultra-right politician Jair Bolsonaro received 46% of the vote in the first round of the Brazilian presidential elections. A racist whose provocative remarks have led to him being described as Brazil's Donald Trump, or even worse, just failed to get the 50% required to win outright, so he's now forced into a runoff which will take place this weekend. Brazil's history, political system, as well as its racial and class composition are complex. Sometimes in the coverage it's been since the first round in the US or in European media, that has been missed as people reduce him to just Brazil's Trump. We decided at All Hail to the Pod to interview Conor Foley. Conor is a university professor who's lived in Brazil for over 15 years. Conor's been a friend of ours for many years, a progressive with thoughtful and astute political analysis. This interview helps us deepen our understanding of Brazil and the processes at play in the rise of Bolsonaro. Follow All Hail to the Pod on social media for updates on the Brazilian presidential election and information on forthcoming episodes. Now, here's the interview. So, firstly, Conor, welcome to the pod.
Thank you very much for having me. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, great to get speaking to you again after all this time. I suppose there's only one place to start, and that's Bolsonaro. I mean, this is somebody who's only, as a political figure, only recently came to our attention here in the UK and in the US as well. But he certainly broke through in the last few weeks, and there's been a lot of coverage of him. So could you maybe just explain to the listeners a bit about who he is and where he's emerged from?
Yeah, he's been a politician for a long time in Brazil. He's been a member of parliament for almost 30 years. Before that, he was a city councillor in Rio. He's ex-military. He was in the parachute regiment in Brazil, and he left under something of a cloud. He wasn't exactly sacked, but he antagonised his superiors. He came into Brazilian politics as the dictatorship was coming to an end, and he was a strong supporter of the dictatorship. But basically, he was considered a bit of a crank. 30 years in Parliament, he never passed a single bill. He never really did anything. And he would make these outrageous declarations. He's extremely homophobic. He's extremely misogynist. He's extremely macho. He's extremely racist. He told one woman Parliament MP that she was too ugly for him to rape her. He's said that poor people should be sterilised so they can't breed any longer. He said he supports torture. He said he would close down the Brazilian Congress. That the only mistake the dictatorship made was they didn't kill enough people. They should have killed 30,000 people, starting with the former president. But he's been saying these sort of things for years and years, and was essentially considered a joke until really about 6 months ago. And in fact, actually up until about a month ago, none of us took him seriously as a potential candidate.
And I suppose so we can immediately see why he's described as Brazil's Donald Trump, but the difference being, as you say, that Donald Trump had that presence in people's living rooms for being a TV star and some sort of personality that Bolsonaro never had, which makes it all more remarkable how he's managed to break through the way he did in the first round of the elections there. But so what exactly is happening for all of these, what looks like a sort of cross-class coalition merging round about this figure who's a bit of a fringe figure, but they're all merging round about him? What's happening there? The narrative we're getting would be that the Workers' Party is obviously mired in corruption, and so they've done really badly, and this figure for the far right has emerged. But when you look at the actual results of the elections, it's clear that the centre and the centre right has collapsed as well. In fact, much more fundamentally than what the PT vote has. So what's going on there? It seems like quite a complex situation that he seems to be the beneficiary of.
Yeah, they're absolutely right. And you're absolutely right in saying it's the centre that's collapsed. The PT vote is roughly where it was. I mean, it's not as high as it should be, but it's the centre that have gone over wholesale to Bolsonaro that's caused this political phenomenon. Now, as I'm Irish, I could go back 500 years to the colonisation. But I think it's worth saying just a couple of things about Brazil. Brazil has an image as a multiracial democracy, as a country of carnival, as a country where people live together, which to an extent is true. But we also have to remember that Brazil is one of the most violent countries in the world, one of the most unequal countries in the world, and one of the most segregated countries in the world. And also it's one of the few countries that has never had a democratic revolution. Basically, the Portuguese came, they colonized it, they exterminated the indigenous population. I mean, there are far fewer indigenous people left in Brazil than in most of Latin America. They introduced slavery, and they were the last country in the world to abolish slavery. And then they imported people from Europe with an explicit aim of whitening the country, because it's roughly half the population are black. But if you go into any middle class area or look at any university or middle class professions, you won't see a black person there. It's an incredibly segregated country. Although, having said which, the ideology of the country is anti-racist. There's never been a movement like the KKK in Brazil. Amongst the Brazilian elite, there's this view that they're multiracial, that they like the idea of a kind of tropical, tolerant place. But it's also very elitist and very stratified. Through the 20th century, sometimes the country alternated between military dictatorships and democracies, but very corrupt democracies. I mean, vote buying was institutionalized. Then in the early 1960s, there was a moderate left government, very, very moderate and not particularly left. But there was enough of concern about what was happening and what was happening in the rest of Latin America for there to be a coup, supported by the United States, but essentially carried out by the military. The military ruled Brazil from 1964 up until 1984, and then a combination of two things. One was an economic crisis, the collapse of oil prices, the rise in US interest rates. The country essentially went bankrupt. And the other was the left movement against the dictatorship. And that took three forms. There were guerrillas. There was a small vanguardist guerrilla movement who closely linked to the Cubans, the Nicaraguans and so on. There was a trade union movement. Brazil has a large working class, and they became actively organized, particularly the car workers, and that's where Lula comes from. And the Catholic Church. Liberation theology was invented in Brazil, and so the Catholic Church has always been, well, most of the Catholic Church have been quite progressive. And so these three forces came together: ex-guerrillas like President Dilma, trade unionists like Lula, and Catholic liberation theologists. And that gave a base which was basically calling for re-establishment of democracy. There was some big strikes. Lula was imprisoned. There were big street protests, and gradually the military began to open up the country. So that there was a transition from democracy, but it was a slow transition. It was called the opening, where they gradually, first of all, they gave themselves an amnesty for all the crimes they'd committed, and then they gradually handed over to civilian leadership. They didn't actually allow for directly elected presidential elections until 1989, and that was largely pressure from PT. But they gradually gave the country back to the civilians, but on the condition they didn't change too many things. So you see exactly the same politicians, well, not the same kind of politicians, but the politicians, Parliament continued to exist, but it didn't have any power. The judges continued to exist, trials continued to happen, but the judges accepted evidence that was clearly obtained through torture. The police essentially continued, the prisons essentially continued. So the architecture of the dictatorship was maintained, although there was this transition to democracy. Lula was the presidential candidate in 1989. He narrowly lost to a figure, kind of charismatic figure, heavily supported by the media, who turned out to be very corrupt and was subsequently impeached. And in the 1990s, a moderate social democratic party, fairly close to New Labour, governed. They had a mixed record. I mean, they privatised things, they followed the Washington Consensus, but they got inflation under control, and they passed some progressive laws. And then in 2002, Lula stood again several times during the 90s without success. And then in 2002, he was elected, which was a huge. I arrived in Brazil in Christmas of 2002. My wife, who's an ex-member of the Workers' Party and very close to its leadership, so I arrived just at that election. And so there was a lot of optimism. But also PT had moved significantly. I mean, think back to that time. You had Blair, you had Clinton, you had sort of the new. So it was quite a moderate PT. They did implement some extremely progressive reforms. The Bolsa Familia, which is a universal grant that pays poor people. They democratized the education system, higher education system and this was Haddad, the PT president. They opened up universities. They introduced quotas so that black people and poor people get into university. They raised the minimum wage massively. The minimum wage quadrupled over the course of 10 years. So inequality went down. They introduced progressive labour reforms, so people in work have much more labour rights. But it was a moderate government, and they did two things which are now coming back to haunt them. The first was in the first term of the election, they basically bought votes. They bribed opposition politicians to pay for their programme. That was exposed. That was called the Mensalon. They were giving monthly payments to corrupt politicians on the right to vote for these progressive reforms. That almost finished the first government, and some of its members were sent to prison. Because the other thing they did was they strengthened the justice system. So there's now, judges are much more independent, prosecutors are much more independent. They will investigate corruption. Before, they never used to investigate corruption. But since 2006, PT reverted to the more traditional coalition building, whereby you do deals with other parties to get their support in Parliament, and in return for which you give them ministries, and the ministries give them access to resources. So if you're the Minister for Health, you've got access to all the spending on health. If you're Minister for Transport, all the roads. And basically, these politicians, mainly not members of PT, although some members of PT were also involved, looted the country. And the scale of the corruption was enormous. There's still no evidence that either Dilma or Lula were directly involved in any of this. There's a separate issue about Lula I'll come back to. But certainly there was corruption, and certainly some members of PT. But in fact, the entire political class were involved in this corruption. There was a corruption investigation by these quite aggressive judges who essentially they're using accomplice evidence. The Supergrass trials in Northern Ireland, where they get one person, they lean on that person and get them to start naming names. Well, that's what they were doing. They were using pre-trial detention, getting people to confess, and getting people to name other people. And through that process, they found a web of corruption that goes through the entire political class of Brazil. In two years ago, there was demonstrations against this corruption and support for the corruption investigations, but it became quite clear that there was an undercurrent to these demonstrations, that people were not just calling for demonstrations against corruption, which we'd all agree with. They were also calling for the downfall of the government, which is perhaps, the impeachment of the government, which is perhaps more problematic in terms of democracy. But also some of the demonstrators were calling for things like return to military dictatorship, down with progressive education, homophobic things. So these slogans were beginning to appear. This is in 2015, 2016. In 2016, as the accusations of corruption were levelled against more and more members of Parliament, the members of Parliament who were facing these corruption allegations decided to impeach the President Dilma, partly as a way of preventing the investigation. They thought if they could get rid of Dilma, they could stop the investigation. She was compromised, of course, because members of her own party had been involved in the corruption, but there's no allegation that she was personally corrupt. In fact, she did a lot to root out the corruption. She was impeached in April of 2016, and so for the last 2 years, the political centre, have essentially been back in charge, and they've proved every bit as useless and every bit as corrupt. And so the antagonism that was demonstrated towards the Workers' Party is now being demonstrated against the Workers' Party and against them as well. At the same time, of course, the other overarching thing is that the economy has still been in a terrible state. Basically, the economy boomed under Lula because commodity prices were very high, coal, steel, oil, copper, and so on. That held up even during the financial crisis that hit Europe and North America. But basically, from 2012, 2013, Brazil's been in an awful economic crisis. And so first Dilma and now Temer, her vice president, who is in power, are hugely unpopular. So with both the centre discredited and the left discredited, that just opened the space for this figure, Bolsonaro, who was, as I said, a fringe figure. But what became clear is that he used these demonstrations. These demonstrations were being organised by quite young people who don't remember the dictatorship, people who've got access to the internet, who doing podcasts, doing Facebook, doing social media. Obviously, middle class people. I mean, this is the rich people, and so they've been mobilising in support of this figure of Bolsonaro, who. Well, I mean, it's difficult to see anything about him that's appealing, apart from that he has this strong image and a strong counter. When the presidential election started, I'll come back to Lula, but when the presidential election started, Lula was the front runner. He was way in front in all the opinion polls, but he was prevented from standing because he was in prison. PT decided on a strategy to defend Lula, and so they put him forward as their candidate, and only at the last minute they substituted Haddad, who was Minister for Education, Mayor of São Paulo. He's a great guy. I mean, he's a moderate, social democratic, honest, but he's not. He had a low profile, and Brazil's a huge country, and you need to be able to talk the language of Brazilians throughout the country. He's a little bit too academic. He's a little bit too the southeast. He's not quite. Doesn't have that profile, and because he didn't have a chance to build it up, when Lula was excluded. He started the race at only 4% in the opinion polls. By the end of the first round, he got up to 27%, which isn't bad. But during the campaign, or at the start of the campaign, Bolsonaro was stabbed. So he's benefited from two things. One, he's got a big sympathy vote. And two, because he actually didn't say anything in the campaign, I think actually that might have helped him, because it's only in the last few days he's fit enough to start talking again. And he's been saying things like he wants to close the Congress, he wants to close the judiciary, he wants to arrest judges. Yesterday he said he wanted to drive the Reds out of the country using a slogan for the military dictatorship: you can love Brazil or you can leave Brazil. So I think Bolsonaro became the candidate by default that people who were protesting came to support him for that reason. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, it's fascinating actually. And so before we come on to what's happening outside from below, if you like, there seems to be some sort of systemic problem here, and what you described from the dictatorships, the transition to democracy. The constitution allows for a presidential system, but it's almost built on a Congress which is going to be inherently unstable because it's based on coalitions. It's almost impossible to get a majority in the Congress. Is that right? And therefore that leads to sort of clientelism and the sort of corruption that you're describing that even affected the Workers' Party?
Yeah, there's about 25 different parties in Congress, and people very frequently defect from one to the other. So Bolsonaro himself, he was in one party he's been in about 5 or 6 different parties. He only joined PSL, the party he's now leader of, a few months ago. And when he joined it only had one member of parliament. He became the second member of parliament, so doubled its size. And that's a big problem. You have these very small parties, very fragmented, people frequently leaving, and basically they're doing it for the money. Well, a lot of the MPs are doing it for the money. You bribe them, and that's the way Brazilian politics works. And a lot of the electorates do the same thing. MPs offer money. I mean, sometimes they literally give out money at their campaign rallies, and the companies that have supplied them with this money then get contracts. That's the nature of Brazilian politics, that it's based on kickbacks and favours and a lack of loyalty. There's very little ideology in Brazil. The Workers' Party is one of the few parties that has an ideological programme. The rest of them are very... There's one party, I think it's called Democracy Now!, which was aligned with the dictatorship. There's another party, the Social Democratic Party, but that's now almost collapsed. Most of the other parties don't really have any political programme. If you look at what moves Brazilian politics, it's much more things like the ruralists, the big farmers have a very strong vote. The evangelicals have a very strong vote. Evangelical Protestantism is now a huge political force in Brazil against the Catholic Church, and it's very right wing. There's also increasingly a large number of police and military people who have been elected. So there's a strong militarist bloc vote. And there's also, as in the United States, a strong gun lobby. People who want, because of the very high crime rate, people want to have weapons to protect themselves. And so obviously there's money going into that. Not sure how much of this externally, I mean, certainly Stephen Bannon's been involved in advising Bolsonaro. Certainly there's links between the Tea Party and probably the NRA. So there are and the evangelicals as well, certainly. So there are political forces coming down from the United States, mobilizing, and that's part of the Bolsonaro question. The other thing is really the question that we find ourselves bemused by is why PT fractured so much. In opposition, it was the Clean Hands Party, it was the anti-corruption party. A big part of its program was anti-corruption, but in government it fractured again and again and again. And so people like Marina Silva is the most obvious, but lots of other people left. I mean, Marina Silva was a founding member of PT. She was a rubber tappers workers union working in the Amazon, defending the rights of indigenous people. She grew up. She was illiterate until she was a teenager. Taught herself to read. She was a comrade of Chico Mendes, who was assassinated, but she left the party, and lots of people left the party. There were splits. And that weakened them. And also some people joined the party. Some of the people who've been accused of the worst forms of corruption are quite recent members of the party. They joined it when they saw it was coming to power because they saw it was the winning party, and they've obviously had a very negative influence on it.
If we could just look at the coalition you described very well there, that seems to be coalescing here against PT, which is like the elites, middle class people, but also the evangelical Protestants, who are sort of buying into this message of social conservatism, targeting the LGBT community and being very strongly against abortion, etc. But that is also seems to be merged with poor people who are going to vote for a sort of law and order message, because, as you say, the issues of safety and security within some of the working class and poorer areas of the country. So that seems a really sort of strange mix to be able to hold together. And he's maybe managing it because he's not saying very much, but is that likely to go beyond the election if he does manage to get elected, or is that going to fracture?
I think it will fracture. I mean, I think the only good thing about the current situation is that Bolsonaro's coalition is quite unstable. You're right about the evangelicals. Marina Silva is also an evangelical Protestant and strong against abortion and equivocal on homosexuality. So she ran against Dilma twice and was beaten, but she picked up a significant vote, and I think that vote, which peeled off significant numbers of Workers' Party support, and as now you saw in the last election, she got less than 1%. I mean, pathetic. And her vote has gone over to Bolsonaro almost wholesale. It was only yesterday that she called for a vote. She called for a vote against Bolsonaro. She's criticised him, but it was only yesterday that she actually said she wasn't neutral. She was saying you've got to vote for Haddad in the election. Fernando Haddad, who was the president of Brazil and who Bolsonaro said he would like to shoot, still hasn't yet formally said that we should vote against Bolsonaro. So, and he's the leader of the Social Democratic movement. So, I mean, the Social Democratic Party has been quite weak on this. In terms of the reforms, I mean, or in terms of the class breakdown, it is a middle class phenomenon. Bolsonaro's support, he massively outpolls Haddad amongst better educated, richer Brazilians, whereas Haddad has the edge amongst poorer Brazilians. If it hadn't been for the votes of the Northeast, which is the poorest part of Brazil, Bolsonaro would have won on the first round. We were watching the results coming in. He was clearly ahead, and then the Northeast, which because it's poorer, the infrastructure is more difficult to collect the votes. As those votes came in towards the end of the evening, that tipped the balance. And that's not surprising. I mean, he has called for. He said one state in the Northeast. He said the only good thing about it is it's prison. He's called black people monkeys. He's called on the poor to be sterilised. He plays into the classic prejudices of the middle class. Where he's uphold PT massively has been in those areas. I mean, in my city, Brasilia, the capital, he's got 72% of the vote. PT at 24%. So that in terms of that class basis, it's very clear. And of course, all Brazilians are scared about crime. I mean, the murder rate is 60,000 a year, which is, that's higher than a war zone. That's more people get killed violently in Brazil every year than got killed, maybe not in Syria, but certainly in the Democratic Republic of Congo or Darfur, or or to give an example, in Northern Ireland, in the 30 years of trouble, there was almost 3,000 people killed. In Rio de Janeiro, there's 4,000 people killed every single year, and 1,000 of them are killed by the police. So there's clearly, people are scared, and that's why people want to defend themselves. People don't trust the police. Obviously support Bolsonaro. 90% of them are supporting him. People don't trust the police, and so that's partly why they want to hang on to their own weapons. And they see these reforms. Brazil has some very, very progressive laws because it's had 20 years of essentially 30 years of essentially social democratic governments. So it's got all sorts of very progressive, politically correct laws and policies and programs. But at the end of the day, people see the reality, and the reality is misery, violence, crime, corruption, hunger, and so people react against that. In the favelas, where the worst of the violence is concentrated, the situation is a little bit more mixed. It's interesting that during Haddad did a walkabout in Rocinha, one of the biggest and oldest favelas in Brazil. Bolsonaro said he would only go in there with a machine gun, and that's the only way he could go in there. So in terms of the poor people living in the worst and most violent neighborhoods, they're still staying loyal to PT. They're not. I don't think they voted en masse for Bolsonaro. He doesn't have that credibility there. But the militias are an important force, particularly in there's two types of organised crime groups. There's the traficantes, the traffic, drug dealers, and then there's the militias. And the militias are mainly police officers, soldiers, off-duty people, and they control half the favelas. The drug traffickers control the other half. The militias are clearly, they have political influence, and they clearly are part of the Bolsonaro phenomenon. There's allegations that at least one of his sons is a member of a militia or has close links to the militia. So the militias clearly are supporting him, and they do have bases. They do control some communities, but I don't think the vote is the people who are voting for Bolsonaro because of violence are necessarily the main victims of violence. It's a little bit like racism and Brexit. People who voted mainly for Brexit are people who live in areas that don't have many immigrants. So I think there's the same kind of thing. Crime is very high, and everyone in Brazil experiences crime. But the people who suffer worse from the crime are the poor, and they're not, as a whole, as enthusiastic about Bolsonaro.
And Bolsonaro's solution to this security, safety issue is almost like on a scale with the Philippines, suggestion that the extermination is going to be part of the solution. I mean, really horrendous state violence is threatening on some of these favelas and other areas as well. So it's going to end very, very badly. And presumably race and class will figure in how that plays out as well, at least the perception of it for people suffering.
Yeah, I wonder if it actually could get any worse, though. I mean, the death rates in, as I said, in Rio, and the police are killing 1,000 people a year. It'd be difficult to see how. I mean, obviously they could step that up, but they're out of control. There's no, in the last, impunity is so entrenched in the Brazilian political culture that police officers who want to kill people do kill people. We have two types of police force, the military police and the civil police, and we say that the civil police torture, the military police kill, and that's pretty much the general view of them. So it's true Bolsonaro is saying, yes, no one should ever be prosecuted for killing people on duty, we should be giving them medals instead. But that kind of rhetoric has been used at a local level for a long time. In Rio, in the 1990s, they introduced what was called the Wild West bonus, which is police officers who killed suspected criminals got a cash bonus. And if you looked at the statistics, I mean, police killings just skyrocketed the moment they introduced it. Then 10 years later, they introduced a new, by then the works party had been controlled, and they said, no, we'll pay you bonuses if the murder rates go down in the territory that you're policing. So rather than how many criminals you've killed, how much violence you've stopped, which is obviously much more progressive, violence promptly plummeted, or the death rate promptly plummeted. But I did some research looking at the statistics. The police simply stopped registering deaths. And so the death rate went down, but the disappearance rate went up. So basically, they just refused to find bodies. And so instead of, it looked very impressive, suddenly the death rate's halved in Rio de Janeiro in a 6-month period, but actually it was just the police fiddling the figures for their own bonuses. So yes, I wouldn't minimise Bolsonaro, and I mean, it wouldn't minimise what he's trying to do, but I think it's the reality is almost already there.
That sort of brings me back to Lula, because Lula's I think I'm correct in saying he's the most popular politician in Brazil, and although he's in jail and barred for standing here, there's two issues, I suppose. Why they've not been able to find someone else apart from him with his sort of sanction, if you like, to stand to have a better chance of winning. But also, I suppose the other question is just the time you're talking about, the last 30 years, we could say, where the commodity boom, where the poor have been lifted up in terms of living standards and things have improved, but not at the expense of the elites, because there was a boom, because there was growth in the economy. And is there, maybe this isn't the best time to ask it this, but is there a sense in which maybe Lula and the Workers' Party didn't go far enough to try and get state apparatus under control? If the police, the way you're describing the police, but also the judiciary and the way that they've been quite political and targeting Workers' Party for corruption disproportionate to other people who are involved in corruption. So is there a sense, looking back, that maybe they should have been a bit more forceful in pushing through change that maybe would have challenged the elites and capital in Brazil?
Oh yeah, no, I think everyone would agree with that. I think you need to break it down a bit, though. I think the first question is, why was Lula unable to bring more people with him, or to bring a new generation of leaders? And there's various answers to that. One of them, of course, is that the Mensalon, the first corruption scandal I told you about, that implicated a lot of the people immediately beneath Lula, so the president of the party, Lula's chief of staff, various high-level people who were all put in prison. So that left a kind of vacuum at the top of the party, immediately beneath Lula. And that's why he chose Dilma, who wasn't actually in the Workers' Party at the time. She was brought in from outside. She'd been his chief of staff, and then she became the presidential candidate. But so there was certainly a problem that PT had on bringing new blood in and getting their national profiles. And again, Haddad, he doesn't have a national profile. He's got a strong profile in the south, but it's the northeast and the north where he needs to win as well. And so that certainly there's been a problem about bringing in new blood. And as I said, also PT have suffered these splits. People like Marina Silva have left the party, and at the state level, at the lower level, they've suffered a bit of a crisis. I mean, morale was very, very low in PT in 2014, 2015, and that's partly why the impeachment happened. The demonstrations against the impeachment only really took off, 2 or 3 months before. There wasn't time to build momentum, and I think if they hadn't impeached Dilma, the Workers' Party would have been absolutely hammered in this election, although possibly there'd be another political scenario. But so they certainly were unpopular. In terms of could they have gone further forward in the program? Yes, certainly they could have done. There's lots of things they could have done that would have been, in terms of much more root and branch reform. Brazil is a strange kind of country. I mean, it's very corporatist. It has a very large number of state-owned companies. I mean, the oil company, like Britain in the 1970s, there was, the commanding heights of the economy are already under state control. So I don't think bringing more under, and that's where all the corruption problems have been. So I think bringing more companies under public control. I mean, and in fact, the Workers' Party did. They did create state companies, and they did use the banking system to channel funding towards creating a stronger base. But economically, I think that it would have been difficult for them to have gone much further. Politically, of course, they should have. They should have dealt with the legacy of the dictatorship. I mean, most of the rest of Latin America put the people who did the torture on trial and sacked the people who oversaw it, and that never happened here. The amnesty law continued. The same people stayed in power. There's now a Supreme Court that's progressive because the majority of its members were appointed under PT. But at the local level, with the judges, with all the elites, they remain untouched. Then the issue about Lula himself, and I just should touch on this. I mean, as you say, he's in jail for corruption, but there were serious problems about his trial, and that's why he still retains significant support. Because there's no actual evidence that he committed corruption in the way that there is evidence against some of the other people. What's alleged to have happened is that after he left the government, he essentially kind of hired himself out to private companies to be a consultant, to give speeches, to organise seminars, to do basically exactly the type of things that Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, and indeed Barack Obama, have done since leaving office, or that Hillary Clinton did. You accept a speaking fee of £2,000 to say something for 5 minutes. It's not, and that's what Lula did. So it wasn't ethical, but there's no real evidence that what he did was dishonest. The crime on which he was convicted is that he's alleged to have accepted an apartment flat worth about £200,000, and that it was refurbished for him by a private company who subsequently got some state contracts. The problem is there's no evidence that he actually owns the flat. There's no document that shows it's his flat. The flat belongs to the company. But members of the company who essentially turned informers' evidence against him said a deal had been done that he would eventually be given this house. But that's it. And the same judge who sentenced him, oversaw his prosecution, has clearly shown himself to be extremely biased against the Workers' Party, has overstepped his constitutional authority on several occasions, and is not seen to be an impartial justice figure. So when Lula was convicted, one of the things that happened was that he then automatically became ineligible to run for the presidency again because of a corruption law that, in fact, his own government introduced. This is the Fisher Limper, the Clean Hands Law. And so it's not difficult to understand why people think the whole reason why he was prosecuted was to rule him out for the presidential election, because he would have won the presidential election. Yeah. Now, you can kind of then go into conspiracy theories, and I don't know. I don't know all the evidence. But that's why he remains a symbol. And so the moment he was arrested and the moment that the trial started, the PT began to mobilise again, because he'd been in prison under the dictatorship. They saw the same people conspiring against him again, conspiring against his government again, and there was an immediate kind of reaction against that. And that's why they refused. They put him up for the presidency, whereas possibly they should have had put Haddad in much sooner, so that give him a chance to build up his profile. And that's also why they didn't create any alliances. And the PT found itself very isolated, rather than align itself with other left forces. And there were. Ciro Gomez is another left candidate who was consistent. He's good. In fact, in some ways, his political platform was more radical than PT's. He came third in the election, 12% of the vote. As I said, the centre party's got 1, 2, 4%, but he came a credible third. Haddad's vote and his vote together probably would have beaten Bolsonaro in the first term if they'd made that alliance. But basically that was a problem, that the left was very splintered. They didn't make the strategic alliances they needed to make. They could have gone in. It's difficult to say that. Haddad's vice or candidate is from the Brazilian Communist Party, which is a significant force. There's a Brazilian sort of Trotskyist party which is backing him. This other party, sort of Social Democratic Party of Ciro Gomez, would be probably to the left of Jeremy Corbyn, but they could have formed a common platform, but they didn't. And then other parties have just gone way over to the centre. So I think there was a lack of political strategy. And for reasons I fully understand, the first point became stop the impeachment, defend Dilma, and then when Lula was arrested, stop the trial, defend Lula. And people looked at the trial and looked at the evidence, said this is not just, this is a political conviction, and so they rallied around Lula. But I think one of the things that probably the reason why the left is now in such a bad state is that most Brazilians will say, well, a lot of the Brazilians will say, well, yeah, maybe he wasn't corrupt, but then again, maybe he was. We don't really know, and we have other concerns, like our families, like our safety, like our incomes, like our conditions. And so I think PT turned the first term of the election into a referendum about Lula, and that antagonised people. I think they needed to find a message that was much more about ordinary people's rights and living standards and safeguards and and anti-poverty, which is the stuff that traditionally PT have been very good at, and they're still. It looks like the election's going to be 40-60, so there's about 40% of the population that are going to vote for the PT candidate, but unless something happens dramatically in the next few days, the other 60%, who are, I'd say probably half of them, or more than half of them, are centrist voters who have, in all previous elections, they voted for the candidates on the centre. So there's only a smaller minority, I mean, it's a significant minority, but it's small, maybe 30%, who are actually voting for someone who they know to be a fascist, they know to be in support of the military dictatorship, who agree with, with what he's saying. I think the rest of it is a protest vote against PT, against us. Just one last thing I'd say, just because I was watching one of Bolsonaro's political broadcasts this morning. Up until today, he's been very careful to say, "Oh, well, I said these things a long time ago, but now I'm not going to return to dictatorship. Now I'm going to have authority, but I'm not going to be authoritarian. I said these things, they're out of context." But last week, one of his sons was recorded, or a video was shown in which he said that he'd shut down the Supreme Court and arrest judges, and no one would bat an eyelid. But then on Sunday night, Bolsonaro recorded a message to his supporters. There were rallies for him across the country, medium-sized rallies. And in that, he used language that was explicitly from the military dictatorship. He said they're going to drive the Reds out of the country, and you can either, if you don't obey the laws of this country, you can either get out the country or you can go to prison. And that's the slogan from the military dictatorship. They used to say, "Brazil, love it or leave it." And they have banners everywhere saying, "Brazil, love it or leave it," which was basically that, which was either leave the country, become a refugee, or stay in and that's, of course, the situation that we're all now in. And it was he made the threat very clearly because he's thinking about what happens next, is that, will we be safe? Can we stay in the country? What will happen to us? What will happen to our families? What will happen if we continue to be critical? So I think he's sending out a very clear message, very close to the election. I mean, we're only a few days away from it now, but he's sending a very clear message to his core base that a vote for him on Sunday is a vote for return to military dictatorship.
And I'm wondering then, just following on from that, what the regional impacts or what the response has been in the region. I'm thinking, like, in 2003, I spent some time in Venezuela, and I was there for Independence Day celebrations, spent a few weeks traveling with projects and barrios and what have you. And speaking to people for the government, one of the big projects that they were very keen to go over was this idea of creating a bloc, a leftist bloc in Latin America, and Lula was part of that. Obviously Bolivia, we had Ecuador, there was Cuba, there was a whole load of different places, and for a while that seemed like it wasn't pie in the sky, it seemed like something that absolutely could happen, to be a bulwark against the United States. Where are we with that? I mean, not only have a lot of these organisations and movements collapsed or in retreat, but they've been replaced by some of these really reactionary far-right forces who are talking the language, at least, of dictatorship and going back the way. So what's been the response in the region to what's happening with Bolsonaro?
Well, yeah, you're right that there was, it was called the pink tide. First Chavez and then Lula won these elections, and then that was followed by a series of left. They were different. I mean, there was Bachelet in Chile is quite different, or Kirchner in Argentina is quite different to what happened in Bolivia or Honduras. But certainly there was a left movement that swept the entire Latin America, and that is now clearly in reverse. There was a movement, UNISOL, which was actually created, which was the United Nations of South America, and the external policy of both Lula and Dilma was, it's anti-imperialist. I mean, they were against the invasion of Iraq. They supported, they've cultivated close links with Venezuela and Cuba. They've been lots of the medical program that I think Dilma implemented, in fact, is bringing over Cuban doctors. So there's thousands of Cuban doctors in Brazil now as part of improving access to medical systems, and that's all in reverse. The Venezuela connection, I'm actually waiting to hear back today about a book that I'm proposing to write for a publisher, and one of the chapters is going to be on Venezuela and Venezuela's role in the Brazilian election.
Look forward
I'm not going to jump the gun on that, because it's a colleague of mine is going to write the chapter, and I want to see what he says before I say anything. I was in Cuba in the summer, but I've never been to Venezuela, so I'm not fair enough with it. But I think the left tide has receded, but what it's being replaced is quite incoherent. And I think Bolsonaro is certainly far more right than any other political leader I know of in Latin America. And of course, on the one hand, we may well have a Bolsonaro-led government, but Mexico has gone left. So, it's not the direction of traffic is not all one way. And there are still strong progressive governments in other Latin American countries. So I don't think it will necessarily change that. I think in each country, there will be movements back and forth. We're seeing it in Peru, we're seeing it in Chile, we're seeing in Argentina, where they now have a centre-right government, which is having an even bigger economic disaster, and they're having to be bailed out by the IMF. So I think that situation is very fluid. I think also that we're a different geopolitical situation with Trump, because Trump has no hegemonic ambitions for the region. I mean, he has gone out of his way to actively alienate, not just, all Latin Americans. I mean, he's a utter bigot and racist. And so that's as offensive to a right-wing Brazilian as it is to a left-wing, because it's us that he's talking about. So I think and clearly, the Cold War is over. We're in a different. The balance of power is quite different. China is much more of a significant economic player in Brazil than either Russia or possibly the United States. And I think there will be regional rivalries playing out at the economic level, but I think that's going to be much more China versus US in Brazil rather than sort of strategic political level. So I think it's difficult to see how it will change the bloc, because the bloc had been in retreat anyway. Certainly, it will be an inspiration, and you can imagine that Brazilians will, Brazilian rightists will start working with in other countries. The other thing about Brazil is because it's such a big country, and it's the only country in Latin America that speaks Portuguese. And also, a lot of the rest of Latin America don't really like Brazil, because not like Argentina. They all hate Argentina, but they see Brazil as a bit of a bully. It's too big, it's too powerful. So there's not as much political links between Brazil and the rest of Latin America as you would imagine. So I think while its influence is going to be obviously important, it's not a game changer, I think.
And we mentioned Steve Bannon earlier, and clearly there's an attempt on the right and far right to create this image, certainly, that this right-wing tide is sweeping the world and it's going to happen everywhere, these right-wing populists. But I think you're right to point out that a lot of times it breaks left as well. It seems to be anti-establishment candidates. I don't know if you're familiar with the economist Mark Blyth in Brown University in the United States, who writes on global Trumpism. He calls it. He's actually a working class guy from Dundee, so interesting character. But he talks about global Trumpism, and he predicted Brexit, predicted Trump. But he points out that you can also place things like Syriza in Greece, or even the SNP in Scotland, as being anti-establishment pitches. And I think maybe we could view Bolsonaro in that sort of scenario where he's appeared, because they didn't obviously have to be anti-establishment, that's just their pitch. So we're in very uncertain times, I think. So I suppose just looking at just to finish up, how do you think this is going to play out? You're saying that you think it looks like he's going to win. What will his presidency look like? He's already said in terms of environment, we've talked about all the stuff with racism, what have you, but he's got to come out the Paris Accord. So how is this going to play out if he does win on Sunday?
I think some of it depends on us. I mean, some of it depends on how quickly we come back and how hard we come back and what we come back on. I think, obviously I'm not Brazilian, so I can't say how the Brazilian left will respond. As I said, I am hoping to attempted to pull together a book, which we will hope to publish early next year, to sort of set out our response and what I think our response is, what a unified response should be to these issues. And clearly, first of all, we're going to have to fight defensively on some issues. Although I was saying that police violence is almost totally out of control anyway, it could get a lot worse. I mean, if they get a green light, then that's certainly going to happen. There has been an uptick in political violence. At least a dozen people have been killed in the last couple of weeks in relation to the election across the country. There's been a lot of homophobic attacks. At the same time, there was a movement called Ellie No, Not Him, which was a women's-led movement, and they had very big protest marches just the week before the election. So I think there will be a counter-mobilisation against him. The evangelical movement, the evangelical vote, is an interesting one because on the one hand it is quite conservative. On the other hand, they are more plainly in the most marginalised communities. They're doing what the Catholic Church was doing 30 years ago, and so they're in the prisons, for example. I mean, I've gone in and out of. I went into a police lockup. They took me into one where there was 600 prisoners in a place built for 60, and only one police officer, only one prison guard in the whole place, and it was full of supposedly the most dangerous traffickants in the city. Yet I was able to walk in, spend half an hour in there talking to them, and come out again completely. And that's the power the evangelicals have. The evangelicals have strong, close links to the community, and so I think any strategy for the left has to include how to reach back to the evangelical community, and then there will be fights because the same issues continue. If Brazil pulls out of the Paris climate accords, that's the Amazon rainforest. That's no matter anything that we do to reduce global emissions in Europe. It's the biggest polluter, and the Amazon rainforest out of it. I mean, the planet fries. So the stakes are kind of high at that level, and I think we need to develop and articulate what the alternatives are. And I think it won't just be on the economy. It will be across a range of issues, and it will be thinking forward what the changes we need and how to mobilise. You mobilise a coalition around each of them, and I think that's been part of the trouble when you're in government is you're defensive, you're defending what you've been doing, and of course there's compromises, and of course it's never as good as you want it to be, and that demobilises people. And so there was a lot of depression about PT and about the Left project. In certainly I think the first of Lula's governments was very progressive. The second was a lot less so, and Dilma's governments in some ways less so still, and of course then there was the economic crisis. So I think it's a mixture of things. You can't control what's going to happen at the global strategic level, what's going to happen in the economy, what's going to happen in issues like that, but it's where you position yourself in the fights that are to come, and certainly the fights are coming.
And it does also seem to be a rise in authoritarian regimes, some of them anti-democratic, so you get the feeling that actually there's a need for it to stand up for democracy as well, and that has to be part of any programme as well, to reconnect the left with the working class, that there has to be that idea that democracy is something to be fought for, because there does seem to be, and Bolsonaro might be part of that, a lot of leaders and movements springing up who are questioning that, something that we sort of took for granted for a long time. Do you get that sense? Obviously it's very acute in Brazil, but do you get the sense that maybe that's tying into something that's a bit broader than that?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, it was the Workers' Party which led the World Social Forum, which was a great initiative for its time, and which was a genuine attempt to bring together progressive forces throughout the world, mobilising. So I think that was, and that died essentially when PT was in government. So I think there's a need to go back to those sorts of back to basics, back to those sorts of roots. It's clearly also the case that the crisis of the centre that I was saying has happened in Brazil is a crisis of the centre throughout the world. I mean, it's not just you look at the social democratic parties in Europe, they're all dying on their feet. You look at how abysmal Hillary Clinton was as a candidate. You look at what happened to Tony Blair's Labour Party. The progressive movements that are coming up in Europe, I mean, it's in Ireland, in Scotland, in the Basque Country. So I think there is and it's people working on different issues, people working on human rights, people working on environmental rights, people working on indigenous rights. So I think it's bringing that movement back together on a truly global basis, and also for the first time not just paying lip service to the South, but so, what's happening in India. I mean, India has again a vile, racist, semi-fascist prime minister. We need to be talking to Indian progressives about how to deal with that. We see the crushing of the Arab Spring and the reimposition of these semi-fascist governments in Egypt and Syria. So again, I think a global debate about where progressive forces are and how we need to reorganise and communicate with each other is part of that agenda.
Absolutely. And I think to end on a positive, one of the things we maybe can learn, and conversations like this can help, is the fundamental importance of solidarity and mutual solidarity, that people working on different things in different parts of the world, different campaigns and movements, is a positive thing. And we need to be learning lessons for everybody. Conor, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. Fascinating situation. And we do send our solidarity to you and all the working class Brazilians out there waiting to see what happens. Good luck.
Likewise. Thanks. And love to everyone in Edinburgh from me.
Thanks for listening. All Hail to the Pod is produced by Cowgate Media. For more information, visit 107cowgate.com.